The night was cold, the streets of Los Angeles buzzing with the restless energy of a city that never truly sleeps. Neon lights flickered against the damp pavement, reflecting off the glassy-eyed wanderers who had nowhere to go. Among them, a man sat hunched on a weathered bench, his clothes tattered, his face hidden beneath an unkempt beard. He clutched a plastic bag filled with what little he had, a few crumpled dollar bills, a dented water bottle, a jacket barely thick enough to keep out the chill. No one paid him any mind. Pedestrians walked past without a second glance, some quickening their steps, others turning their heads as if his very existence was something offensive. He was invisible. And that was exactly what he wanted. Keanu Reeves exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool night air. He had played many roles in his life, assassins, heroes, outcasts, but tonight, he was taking on a part unlike any other. Tonight, he wasn't an actor. He was an experiment. It had started as an idea, a fleeting thought during a conversation with a friend about how society truly viewed those on the fringes. Do people still have empathy? Do they still care? Or have we become so disconnected that kindness is nothing more than an inconvenience? Now, as he sat beneath the buzzing glow of a flickering street lamp, the reality of his plan settled in. He wasn't Keanu Reeves anymore. Not to them. He was just another nameless soul drowning in a sea of indifference. His stomach growled, a sharp, hollow reminder that he hadn't eaten all day. He rose to his feet, slow and deliberate, feeling the ache in his bones from hours of sitting on concrete. Across the street, a McDonald's beckoned with its bright golden arches, promising warmth, food, and, perhaps, something more, a glimpse into human nature. As he crossed the street, he caught the wary eyes of a young couple stepping out of an Uber. The woman clutched her purse a little tighter. The man placed a protective hand on her back. They whispered to each other, their expressions shifting from surprise to discomfort before they hurried inside. Keanu smirked. This is going to be interesting. Pushing open the heavy glass door, he stepped inside, immediately feeling the sharp contrast between the cold night and the artificial warmth of the restaurant. The smell of sizzling fries and greasy burgers filled the air, a stark reminder of just how hungry he actually was. A few heads turned. A mother pulled her child closer. A group of teenagers at a nearby table exchanged amused glances before snickering under their breaths. No one recognized him. Not yet. He walked up to the counter, dropping a handful of coins onto the counter with a soft clatter. The cashier, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Clara, glanced at the money and then at him. Her polite smile faltered for just a moment. One hamburger, Keanu said, his voice even, controlled. Clara hesitated, glancing at the coins. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. From behind her, the heavy thud of approaching footsteps sent a ripple of tension through the air. A man emerged from the back office, his presence radiating authority. His name tag gleamed under the fluorescent lights, Coleman, manager. His sharp eyes locked onto Keanu with immediate disdain, his lips curving into a smirk that carried no warmth. What's going on here? Coleman's voice was laced with impatience, as if the very act of Keanu standing at his counter was an inconvenience. Clara swallowed. He wants a hamburger, but... Coleman barely waited for her to finish before scoffing. You got money to pay for that? His gaze flicked to the pile of coins, then back to Keanu, expression twisting with something dangerously close to amusement. Keanu met his eyes, unwavering. That's all I've got. A beat of silence passed. Somewhere in the restaurant, the sizzle of frying oil popped, a chair scraped against the floor, but no one spoke. Then Coleman laughed, short, dry, and utterly devoid of kindness. Well, then I guess you don't have enough. And if you don't have enough, you can't eat here. The finality in his tone was sharp, slicing through the air like a blade. Around them, customers had stopped pretending not to listen. Eyes flickered toward the counter, toward the confrontation unfolding before them. Some looked uncomfortable. Others merely watched, curious but detached, waiting to see how this scene would end. Keanu didn't flinch. Didn't react. He had anticipated this. But anticipation didn't make reality any easier to swallow. He tilted his head slightly, studying the man before him. And for the first time, he wondered just how far this was going to go. Clara's fingers twitched against the register, hesitation flickering across her face as she glanced between the pile of coins and the cold expression on her manager's face. The weight of the moment pressed heavy on her chest. She had seen struggling customers before, parents who came up a few cents short, tired workers scraping together change for a coffee, but none had been met with this level of disdain. Something about this felt different. Keanu stood still, his posture relaxed but unreadable. He wasn't pleading, wasn't begging. He simply was, waiting to see what would happen next. And maybe that's what unsettled her the most, he wasn't ashamed of his situation. He didn't lower his gaze or try to justify why he had so little. Coleman let out a small, exasperated sigh, crossing his arms. "Look, buddy. This is a business, not a soup kitchen. You want to eat here? You pay like everyone else." Silence stretched between them. Clara swallowed hard, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. It was policy, sure. But policies weren't meant to strip people of their dignity. Keanu's voice was calm, measured. "And if I don't have enough?" Coleman smirked, shifting his weight onto one leg as if the conversation bored him. "Then you find somewhere else to go. You're holding up the line." Behind Keanu, a few customers shuffled impatiently. A man in a tailored suit checked his watch, clicking his tongue in irritation. A teenager rolled her eyes and whispered something to her friend, both of them giggling. An older woman near the condiment stand sighed, shaking her head. Clara's jaw tightened. The right thing to do was obvious, but the consequences were, too. She had worked this job long enough to know how Coleman operated. He was all about control, about making sure everyone knew their place. Challenging him meant risking everything. She flicked her eyes toward the tray of cancelled orders near the back of the counter. There, sitting untouched, was a burger, a mistake, meant to be tossed. She could just hand it over. A simple act of kindness. Her fingers twitched again, reaching. "Clara." Coleman's voice cut through the air like a blade. She froze. His stare was sharp, unyielding. He had noticed. "What do you think you're doing?" She hesitated, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "It's just going to be thrown away." Coleman's smirk vanished, his expression darkening. "That's not your call to make." Clara's pulse pounded in her ears. Every fiber of her being told her to stand her ground, but the years of working under Coleman's watch had drilled something else into her, fear. He had fired people for less. Keanu, still standing silently, watched the exchange with quiet interest. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Coleman let out a sharp breath, shaking his head in disappointment. "Jesus, Clara. You can't just. I'll pay for it." Keanu's voice cut through the noise, smooth and unwavering. For a second, the whole restaurant seemed to still. Coleman blinked. "Excuse me?" Keanu nodded toward the register. "I'll pay for the burger. Just put it on my tab." A beat of silence. Then Coleman laughed. It was short, sharp, and filled with nothing but mockery. "On your tab? Buddy, you don't even have enough for the damn sandwich. How exactly do you plan to pay for it?" Keanu's lips curled ever so slightly. Not a smile, but something close. A flicker of amusement, of curiosity. "I'll find a way." The way he said it, so steady, so sure, made Clara's breath hitch. Coleman, however, had had enough. The amusement drained from his face, replaced with something harsher, something more calculated. "Not my problem." He turned to Clara, his tone dropping to something colder. If you give him that burger, don't bother clocking in tomorrow. The words hit harder than she expected, stealing the breath from her lungs. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over the tray. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, her job, her rent, everything she had worked for, hanging in the balance. Keanu's eyes met hers, steady and patient, as if telling her that the choice was hers alone to make. And in that moment, she knew. With a deep breath, Clara grabbed the burger, wrapped it carefully in a napkin, and held it out. Here, she said softly. Keanu reached for it, his fingers just brushing against the paper. And then Coleman slammed his palm down on the counter. The sound cracked through the restaurant, making several customers jump. What the hell do you think you're doing? Clara jerked back, startled, the burger still clutched in her hand. The air in the room had shifted, the tension now razor-sharp. Coleman's face was twisted in something ugly, anger, disbelief, maybe even betrayal. I warned you, he hissed. You're fired. The words dropped like a hammer. For a moment, Clara couldn't breathe. Her ears rang. Her vision blurred at the edges. Fired. Over a burger. A goddamn burger. The restaurant fell into a heavy silence. Keanu stood still, watching her, waiting. The customers, once indifferent, were now invested. Some whispered, others shifted uncomfortably. A mother at a nearby booth clutched her child's hand a little tighter. A young man at the soda machine shook his head, muttering something under his breath. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat, willing herself to stay composed. This isn't right, she whispered. Coleman scoffed. Welcome to the real world, sweetheart. Now get your stuff in. I'd rather lose my job than lose my humanity. Her own voice surprised her. It was stronger than she expected, unwavering despite the storm raging inside her. Coleman's jaw clenched. His nostrils flared. For the first time, he seemed genuinely unsure of what to say. Then Keanu moved. Slowly, deliberately, he placed the burger back on the counter. All eyes were on him. Enjoy your rules, he said to Coleman, voice smooth as silk. Then he turned and walked toward the restroom. No one knew what was about to happen next. But it was going to change everything. Coleman stood frozen, his lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes flicking between Clara and the burger still resting on the counter. The tension in the room was suffocating, a slow-burning fuse just waiting to ignite. The employees behind the counter exchanged nervous glances, unsure if they should keep working or brace for whatever came next. The customers, once merely passive spectators, were now fully invested in the unfolding drama. Keanu had disappeared into the restroom, leaving behind a vacuum of uncertainty. Clara swallowed hard, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, but she refused to back down. She wasn't ashamed of what she had done. If anything, she felt lighter, as if the weight of quiet compliance had finally lifted off her shoulders. Coleman, however, was seething. His authority had been questioned, challenged right in front of customers and employees alike. He couldn't let that stand. His grip tightened on the counter's edge, knuckles whitening as he exhaled through his nose. You think this is some kind of game, he hissed, voice low but sharp enough to cut. Clara didn't flinch. No, she said, steady, her voice void of regret. I think it's about doing the right thing. A murmur rippled through the restaurant. Someone near the soda machine whispered, she's got guts. A man in a dark business suit rubbed his chin thoughtfully, while an older woman near the window let out an approving hum. Coleman ignored them. His eyes bore into Clara like a hawk assessing its prey. You don't decide what's right and wrong here, he snapped. You follow the rules, or you don't work here. It's that simple. Something inside Clara snapped. Maybe it was the months, years, of working under his rigid, heartless management. Maybe it was the exhaustion of watching people like him treat struggling customers like garbage, as if dignity was a privilege only the wealthy deserved. Or maybe it was the realization that, deep down, she had always been afraid of standing up for herself. But not anymore. She straightened her shoulders. If that's how you see it, then maybe this isn't the place for me. The words hung between them like a challenge. Coleman let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head as if she had just said the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. You think you're some kind of hero, he sneered. Trust me, no one cares. You'll be forgotten before you even walk out that door. But the moment the words left his mouth, he realized his mistake. Because the restaurant wasn't silent anymore. A soft, slow clap echoed from the side. Then another. And another. Until it built into a ripple of applause that spread through the room like wildfire. Clara blinked, caught off guard. Customers, ordinary people who had sat quietly, watching this all unfold, were now standing up, their faces no longer blank but filled with something else. Admiration. Support. She's right, a woman near the door called out. That was unnecessary. Ridiculous, another man muttered. A teenage girl raised her phone, already recording. This is so going viral, she whispered to her friend. Coleman stiffened, his eyes darting across the crowd, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt cracked through his composure. This was slipping out of his control. Then the restroom door swung open. And everything changed. Keanu stepped out, no longer hunched, no longer the forgotten man in ragged clothes. His disguise was gone, wiped clean with water and a few quick adjustments. The unkempt beard had been brushed down. The dirt smudges on his face were gone. His sharp, chiseled features were unmistakable now. A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. One by one, people recognized him. Oh my God, someone breathed. No way. That's Keanu Reeves. The energy in the room shifted in an instant. What had once been a quiet, tense standoff between a fast food manager and an employee was now something much bigger. Coleman's mouth opened, then shut again, his brain visibly struggling to catch up. His face drained of color as the weight of realization hit him like a freight train. Keanu met his gaze, his expression unreadable. You were saying. His voice was calm, smooth, but underneath it was something else. Something dangerous. Coleman swallowed hard. His usual cocky, smug demeanor was unraveling at the seams. This wasn't just some random homeless guy he could throw out. This was one of the most recognizable actors in the world. And he had just humiliated himself in front of him. The restaurant had gone from uneasy silence to absolute chaos. People were filming. Customers whispered excitedly, some pulling out their phones to text friends. A group of college kids in the back were already Googling, Keanu Reeves' homeless experiment. Clara just stared. Keanu turned back to her, his expression softening just a fraction. Thank you, he said simply. She felt a lump rise in her throat. Coleman, still frozen in place, looked as if he were about to be sick. His reputation, his job, his entire sense of authority had just crumbled before him in real time. He started, but his voice faltered. His eyes flicked between Keanu, the cameras, the customers all whispering and pointing. He was losing control of the situation. Fast. Keanu stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Coleman could hear. You could have handled this differently, he said, not unkindly. You still can. Coleman's breath was unsteady. He knew what Keanu was saying. He knew that every choice he made in the next few minutes would determine whether this was just a humiliating moment, or a full-blown disaster. He licked his lips. I didn't know. Keanu tilted his head slightly. That's the problem, isn't it? Coleman flinched. Keanu didn't need to say more. Because the entire world was watching. Coleman's throat was dry, his mind scrambling for a way out of this nightmare unfolding in front of him. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, the burning heat of cameras capturing his every expression, every twitch of panic surfacing beneath his usual mask of authority. The reality was sinking in. He had just humiliated Keanu Reeves. The man in front of him, no longer the ragged, unkempt figure he had dismissed so easily, exuded an undeniable presence. Keanu wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't making a scene. He didn't have to. The quiet command in his stance, the unshaken steadiness in his gaze, was enough to make Coleman feel small. Keanu sighed softly, breaking the silence that had swallowed the restaurant. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect," he said, voice even but carrying a weight that sent a shiver down Clara's spine. The words hit harder than Coleman expected. His mouth opened, then shut again, as if he were trying to piece together an excuse, some kind of justification that would make all of this go away. But there wasn't one. Someone in the crowd scoffed. "Yeah, manager of the year right here." A murmur of agreement rippled through the restaurant. Clara, still standing behind the register, looked at Keanu, still trying to process everything. She had been prepared to walk out of this place jobless, possibly even humiliated. But now the entire script had flipped. She watched as Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, an envelope. He turned to her, extending it without hesitation. "This is for you," he said simply. Her brow furrowed in confusion as she hesitantly took it. The envelope was heavier than she expected. With trembling fingers, she opened it, her breath catching the moment she saw the check inside. $50,000. A collective gasp filled the restaurant. Clara's eyes darted from the check to Keanu, her brain refusing to believe what she was seeing. Her voice cracked. "I can't accept this." Keanu's smile was soft, understanding. "You can. And you should." Tears burned at the back of her eyes, her chest tightening with emotions too tangled to untangle. This wasn't just money. This was validation. This was proof that standing up for what was right wasn't a mistake. Behind her, Coleman looked like he had been physically struck. His face paled, his eyes darting between the check and the murmuring crowd. He knew that no matter what happened next, his reputation here was shattered. And then, something unexpected happened. A man near the back, dressed in a crisp business suit, stepped forward and pulled out his wallet. He placed a $50 bill on the counter. "For the next person who can't afford a meal." The room stilled for half a second. Then, another person stepped forward, a woman in her mid-40s, her expression tight with emotion. She set down a 20. Same. Then another. And another. Within minutes, a small pile of cash had formed on the counter, a silent but powerful testament to what Keanu had just reminded them, that kindness, no matter how small, mattered. Clara covered her mouth with a trembling hand. Keanu turned back to Coleman, who was now visibly sweating, his confidence reduced to dust beneath the weight of the moment. I can fix this," Coleman stammered, his voice lacking the ironclad arrogance it had held just minutes ago. We can start a donation program. Something official." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "It's not about programs, Coleman." His voice was softer now, but still firm. "It's about how you treat people. It starts with you." The words landed like a hammer, the final nail in the coffin of Coleman's authority. He exhaled shakily, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he wasn't just losing control of this situation. He was losing who he thought he was. Keanu looked around at the restaurant, at the pile of money growing on the counter, at Clara, still holding the check like it might disappear if she blinked. His voice, when he spoke again, was steady and clear. "If we all did a little more of this," he gestured to the small acts of kindness unfolding around them, "the world would be a very different place." And then, with a final glance at Clara, he turned toward the door. Everyone in the restaurant watched as he walked away, his presence lingering even after he disappeared into the night. But what he left behind, that would last much longer. The door swung shut behind him, but the echo of what had just happened remained, thick and heavy in the air. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if time itself had been paused, the reality of what had just unfolded settling deep into the bones of every person in that restaurant. Clara stood frozen, still gripping the check in her trembling hands. It felt surreal, like a dream that had no right to exist in the waking world. Just minutes ago, she had been certain she was walking out of here unemployed, humiliated, and questioning every choice she had made. Now, she held in her hand something more than money, proof that doing the right thing still mattered. Proof that kindness wasn't just a naive, hopeless fantasy. A sound broke through the silence. Applause. One person. Then two. Then more. The small ripples built into a wave, an eruption of claps, voices murmuring words of admiration, of agreement, of realization. Clara blinked back tears. She had never felt seen like this before. Coleman, however, had never felt smaller. He stood behind the counter, shoulders hunched, his once ironclad authority now reduced to rubble beneath the weight of a moment he had no control over. A man in a leather jacket, arms crossed, let out a short laugh. "Well," he said, shaking his head, "that was one hell of a wake-up call, huh?" A woman standing near the entrance turned to Clara. "That was brave," she said softly. "Not a lot of people would have done what you did." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat, trying to steady her voice. It just felt like the right thing." The woman smiled. "That's the thing about doing the right thing. It's hard. But when someone finally does it, it reminds the rest of us that we should have, too." More murmurs of agreement. Someone else stepped forward and placed another $20 bill on the counter. "For whoever needs it next," they said. Then another. And another. The pile of money, once just a few bills, grew into something much more, a symbol, a movement, a tangible reminder that people still cared. Coleman's hands tightened into fists at his sides, his face pale. He opened his mouth as if to say something, maybe to defend himself, maybe to scramble for whatever dignity he had left, but the words never came. He had lost them, just as he had lost everything else in the span of a single evening. Clara turned, finally meeting his eyes. He looked so different now. Not the looming, dominant manager who had always seemed untouchable, but a man who had just been forced to see himself for the first time. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. She exhaled, her grip on the check tightening just slightly. "I quit," she said simply. Coleman flinched, as if the words had physically struck him. Her voice, though quiet, carried across the room like a statement carved in stone. And for the first time since this entire thing began, she was the one in control. The customers, the employees, the strangers who had witnessed something unforgettable, watched as she removed her name tag, set it gently on the counter, and walked away. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She walked with her head high, her back straight, her heart lighter than it had ever been. As she stepped toward the exit, someone held the door open for her. A teenage boy, still clutching his phone, eyes wide with something like admiration. "You're kind of a legend now," he murmured as she passed. She smiled. Not because of the attention. Not because of the spectacle. But because, for the first time in her life, she had stood for something. And that? That was worth more than any paycheck. The night air hit her skin as she stepped outside, cool and refreshing, like the first breath after years of drowning. She glanced around, her eyes instinctively searching for him. And there he was. Keanu stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching the streetlights flicker against the pavement. He turned as she approached, his expression calm, unreadable, but warm in a way that made her chest tighten. "Hell of a night," he said. Clara let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. That's one way to put it. A comfortable silence stretched between them. Then Keanu spoke again, softer this time. You did good in there. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign that this was all just some elaborate, twisted dream. But it wasn't. It had been real. Every impossible second of it. I didn't think, she admitted. I just did it. That's how the best choices happen, he said. Not because they're easy. But because they're right. Clara glanced down at the check, the weight of everything finally catching up to her. Her life had changed in an instant. She had no job. No plan. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of that. She looked back up at him. Why me? Keanu smiled, small but knowing. Because when the moment came, you didn't hesitate. You listened to your heart. Her throat tightened. Keanu nodded toward the street. Wherever you go from here, make it count. She swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to spill over. I will. For a moment, they just stood there. Two strangers who had met under impossible circumstances, forever changed by a single night. Keanu gave her one last nod, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the city like he had never been there at all. Clara exhaled, her breath visible in the cool air. A new beginning. And for the first time in a long, long time. She wasn't afraid of it.